All right, it is 3:01 p.m. We're going to get started with, I'm very excited to announce our panel today. I have a few minutes worth of introductions and housekeeping, and then I will pass it off to my wonderful colleague, Rayanne Chartrand. So, welcome to the NIIPA in the 1990s, a panel discussion presented as part of NIIPA 2020 exhibition at the McMaster Museum of Art. I am Teresa Gregorio, Education Officer at the museum, and I will be introducing our panel today before handing it over to Rayanne. I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking today from Hamilton, Ontario, which is within the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee nations and the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I'd also like to express my gratitude to the generations of Indigenous peoples for their care of this land, which I have and continue to benefit from. At the museum, we acknowledge the institutions we sit within, the museum and the university, are colonial institutions. It is our responsibility to disassemble these harmful foundations in order to build on new, healthy ones. It is our responsibility to respect Indigenous ways of knowing and be in good relations, adhering to the agreements that have existed here for generations. We hope our time together today is part of actively moving forward in a spirit of empathy and partnership. I would like to introduce, you may have noticed, our interpreters today. We have two ASL interpreters, Diane Diondrat and Annette Sandy. Thank you, Diane and Annette, for working with us today. The NIIPA 2020 is the capstone exhibition of a 5-year curatorial research project on the Native Indian and Inuit Photographers Association, which is of course NIIPA. Founded in Hamilton in 1985, NIIPA was a group of Indigenous image makers from across Turtle Island who came together to promote a positive, realistic, and contemporary image of Indigenous peoples through the medium of photography. The organization played a critical role in advocating for, supporting, and building up a community of emerging and established Indigenous photographers in Canada and the United States. Despite NIIPA being one of the longest operating Indigenous artist service organizations in Canada from 1985 to 2005-6, very little is widely known about the group. Our discussions today will focus on NIIPA in the 90s, building upon the museum's 2018 panel, which focused on NIIPA's establishment and early work in the late 80s. In terms of housekeeping for today's panel, we will have a 45-minute roundtable discussion, then a 30-minute open chat or Q&A. Please load your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can load them throughout the event, and they will be brought to the panelists in the last half hour of the discussion. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be distributed for access after the panel. With that, I would like to begin with a brief introduction of each of the panelists here with us today. Yvonne Maracle, Mohawk, was a founding staff member and one of the first directors of NIIPA. Yvonne and Brenda Mitten co-directed NIIPA until Brenda's departure in 1987, after which Yvonne assumed sole directorship until her departure in 1998, though she continued to actively assist the organization, both as a board member and an advisor to Carol Hill. Carol Hill, who we also have with us today, is Mohawk, was involved with NIIPA in the early 90s and was project coordinator and administrative director for NIIPA from 1998 until the organization closed in 2005-2006. In 1992, Carol began a photographic book exhibition project, See Through Our Eyes, First Nations Perspectives, described as the biggest photographic book on First Nation people of today, designed to illustrate how Native Americans see themselves 500 years after contact with the European culture. We also have with us today Tim Johnson, who is Mohawk, a photographer and was one of the founding board members of NIIPA. Tim was one of the artists who began hosting regular photography workshops at NIIPA's office in Hamilton. These workshops were one of NIIPA's key offerings, showing their interest in supporting amateur photographers in their mission to increase the visibility of Indigenous photography. As an experienced education, museum, and arts executive, Tim is founder of Landscape of Nations 360 Degrees Indigenous Education Initiative, artistic director of Celebration of Nations, conceptual founder of Indigenous Niagara Living Museum Tour, executive producer of the multiple award-winning documentary Rumble, The Indians Who Rocked the World. I'm sorry.
I like that.
Oh, you're so wonderful. As well as the former associate director for museum programs at the Smithsonian's Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. And finally, I would like to introduce our moderator, Rayanne Chartrand, who is the curator of Indigenous art at the McMaster Museum of Art and the festival curatorial advisor to Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival. Rayanne is a Métis curator based in Hamilton with over 10 years of experience producing interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary exhibitions, showcases, and festivals. Her curatorial work focuses on the praxis of survivance, Indigenous epistemes, relational aesthetics, representational politics, and gratitude. Rayanne is a co-founder of the Shishkateo Collective, an equity-seeking and advocacy group organizing on behalf of Métis artists and arts workers to increase Métis representation, capacity, and flourishing within the Canadian arts milieu. She has also served as a board member with the Indigenous Curatorial Collective since 2018 and currently sits on the executive committee as secretary. And I am very pleased and honored to hand it over to you, Rayanne.
Merci miigwech, Teresa, for those introductions. It's super exciting to be sitting with the three of you today. I have so much admiration for you all. I'm a little emotional because it's so crazy that we're finally at this point where we're actually getting to talk about all the things that we've been talking about behind closed doors for many years and really bringing it to the fore and to share it with the public. So this is really exciting. And I'm just super honored that Tim, you could be involved this time, Carol, that you could be involved this time. Yvonne participated in the first panel along with three other founding early members, Greg Stotts, Brenda Mitten, and Raquel. So just want to honor them and the contributions that they've made to this dialogue. So I guess we'll kind of launch right into it since we've got 45 minutes together and a lot of history to cover. And
I have an announcement I need to make. I'm so sorry about this. Yeah. I may be leaving this meeting. We just got a tornado warning.
Oh no.
Not meant to do this. I'm not meant to do this. So I will stay online as long as I can. Okay. It just came across the alert is on television and on the radio. So okay. Well, yeah. So at first I thought it was just going to be thunderstorm, but now we do have tornado warnings. So
okay, we'll do our best, Yvonne, and you just keep me posted. and so, which is good. The first question is actually for you. So hopefully we squeeze you in here. So I just wanted to kind of start at the beginning for those folks who didn't attend the first panel talk and just kind of outline how NIIPA came to be. So the sort of who, what, where, when, and how of NIIPA's story. And what role did you and Tim, because Tim was there from the beginning, play in NIIPA's founding and its early years? And why did you folks want this collective? Tell us why.
Well, for myself, I have a different role in this picture, in the sense that I actually started working in 1983 for Lynn Sharman, who was running the Photographers Union Gallery at that time. So I was her co-op student. Okay, so I came in, she's seen my artwork, my photography work, and then sought me out, and she ended up hiring me as a co-op student. And then from being a co-op student, the following year, she actually hired me as the summer student. So it was during that period of time that she took an interest in Indigenous photography. And she asked me, where are your Indian photographers? And at the time, I was very young, I was what, 19 going on 20. And I said, I don't know, right? So anyway, that kind of interested her in the sense. And then later on, she ended up developing another program in which we were able to hire Brenda Mitten. And so I worked for Lynn actually 2 years prior to Brenda coming on board. And so when Brenda came on board, again, that question being, where are your Indian photographers? Who's out there? What's going on? And so at that time, it again, interest. And it was like, okay. So with that kind of discussion, we started looking at, well, why don't we look at bringing a conference or having a conference and bringing people together? And this was the early time when, Rick Hill, Tim himself as well. This was the beginning of people coming together. So one of the main jobs that Brenda had, which she was really good at, was communication, calling people and things like that. I was more behind the scenes grunt in the sense of I do work. I'm not a figurehead. I'm not on the phone. I may be doing that now, but when I was, again, I was very young, at least 10 years younger than everybody else that was on the team. So, I really look towards, Tim and Rick for guidance, even for Brenda. Like, everybody was so much older than me. But that was my first task, actually, was to find the funding for this conference. And I did. I applied to the Canada Council and I got 15,000. And I was so happy and proud of myself. Like, that was my first grant, like, whoa. And then again, Brenda was already hired. So, it moved forward. Now she was contacting the different photographers. We're trying to find as many photographers as possible. And with Tim being local to the area, it helped a lot. And again, with Rick, so I know personally, thank you, Tim. I relied on you a lot when I was very young. Same with Rick. I felt like little sister, because everybody was older than me and, trying to do, bring photography to the forefront. I know a lot of the photographers back then were like, they felt they were working in isolation. And not only that, it was a taboo art. Photography was a taboo art back in those days. A lot of people feared taking an image of a person, you're taking their soul, right? Or their spirit. So, so we were going against that. We're going against, the whole idea of photography was a taboo medium. We're going against in the sense that it was new to Indian people because it was taboo. So taking it on and starting to do something with it, that's kind of what inspired. And knowing that there were more people out there that were really want to make a difference through photography. So that's when I found, like, after the conference, getting to meet all these great people that came forward. And it's in reality too, that's kind of where I found my voice. I used to be very quiet back then, but I was able to speak it. And I personally have grown from NIIPA in the sense that it helped to give me a voice. It helped me to make me speak and to say what I needed to say. But I'll tell you, one of the biggest challenges I ever had in my life, because again, when I felt, I was just a young punk. I was the young punk there. And, my photography expertise came from high school. I specialized in arts and the business side. That's how I came to be. Tim could speak a little bit more about as to how he came in the door. But like I said, for me, the journey started right out of high school. And having the opportunity to be chosen and to work in a gallery and that is my school of hard knocks, because I had to learn everything that way. And like for me, I looked at Tim like he was so, already he had things going on. He had, where he was working, and then he had his publication of the turtle. I was so impressed. I was like, honest to God, like I was little compared to everybody else, right? So I'm going to get emotional, but good learning experience. I was surrounded by people that helped me to get NIIPA through, right? Because I really looked at it. It was a curse and a blessing in the same, because I was led to this path, but I wasn't the true photographer. I did not have that same ambition as some of my other photographers did. Okay. To me, I think Creator put me in that position to make accommodations for the photographers that needed to express themselves, that needed to show their work, that needed to be recognized as professional photographers. So again, I'm going to shut it there with me, and I want Tim to speak as to his involvement.
Well, this is perfect because Tim has the next question. But yeah, I think the thing to acknowledge, and Tim can speak to this more for sure, is just the different points at which the member photographers were at in their artistic development, in their professional development. It ran the gamut of like emerging to established folks who were photojournalists, folks who were more into experimental. So to kind of homogenize the NIIPA group, I think is a real problem, because it was such a diverse group of not only Indigenous image makers in terms of their nation affiliation, but actually what they were really interested in creating. And I think you can see from some of the work behind me that it's really diverse in terms of what was being produced. So Tim, my question for you kind of builds on Yvonne's question. And I guess I just wanted to know, like, what inspired you to join NIIPA, both as a member, but also as a founding board member? And what do you think NIIPA offered you folks that you couldn't find elsewhere?
Well, it's really interesting, particularly after all these years, the different perceptions that we hold of the past. Because Yvonne talks about relying upon us, but I felt really that we were relying upon the leadership of Yvonne and Brenda in this work, and found it really exciting and compelling that this organization emerged, right? And I think what it really signals is the power of convening, so that idea, that central idea of bringing Indigenous photographers together, that hadn't really happened before. And that was a new idea, and it had a lot of currency and power. And so I think for those of us, as Yvonne had mentioned, we were all doing our thing out there in the world, but we weren't necessarily networked to others who were doing the same things or were connected to photography. And so when NIIPA came along and brought us together, it was really inspiring. And so, we had the opportunity to convene as a group, and then have conversations and learn from each other. And so that to me is the power of NIIPA, the power of convening, the power of a fresh new idea. And again, we all were doing our different things. Some of us were art photographers, others of us were photojournalists or documentarians, and so forth. Yet I felt we were all responding to the leadership that Yvonne and Brenda were providing, and it felt really, really good. And so the other part of that is just affirmation, right? So now there's an organization that is basically providing affirmation about what you're doing, that this is significant, and this is important, and this is valuable. And so, I just have, when I think back to those days, it's good feelings, it was like good vibes around the NIIPA office to show up and engage with Yvonne and Brenda and the other photographers and the conferences that were held. It was really, really exciting. And then the other part of it, I think, is once that convening happened, everyone was motivated, had more motivation to get back to what it was they were doing, and try to achieve new levels of whatever it is that they were pursuing. So that was, to me, was a big outcome, as it really the affirmation and encouragement that we got from the fact that this organization existed. So I find it amazing looking back on it, and where many of the photographers went and what grew out of NIIPA, as the planting of a seed. And this is the power of thought, good thinking, and good ideas. That you never can tell where it's going to go, and where NIIPA went. I think that's one of the big stories for me, is actually what it achieved and where it went after it was established.
Thank you so much for that, Tim. That's such a perfect segue into the next kind of half of the things we want to talk about, I just really want to acknowledge NIIPA's history. It existed for 20 years. That is no small feat within the scope of Indigenous art service organizations. It's still one of the longest existing, even though it doesn't exist anymore. It lengthwise, time-wise, existed for a really long time and served for a really long time, and not just locally, but regionally and nationally and across Turtle Island. And so that's hard work. This is pre-internet, folks. So,
Yeah.
so this is
Oh,
folks
yeah.
picking up the phone and cold calling, Brenda calling friendship centers, Yvonne calling Tim calling everyone he knew, Carol calling somebody, you know, and finding a way, as Rick or as Tim said, to convene. And I think that is what was so special about NIIPA, is that these annual conferences were this key fixture of the activities, and they changed in scale and scope through the years, but that was always like, how do we get together and share ideas and share what we're working on and offer critique and do some workshops and just better our practice. And so I'm going to turn to Carol, because your role kind of really came in the 90s, and so NIIPA had already been around for a couple of years at that point. And so we can see an evolution in the work. So can you just kind of share with us a little bit about your role with NIIPA and more, I guess, more specifically, the role you played with See Through Our Eyes, the book project, and why it later became an exhibition. You know, it was originally started off as this book project and then turned into an exhibition, but all of you were involved. But Carol was the coordinator, so I want to give Carol the floor on this one.
Okay. So I came to work at NIIPA. I met Yvonne off at one of our friends, mutual friends we had never met before. And she had just got a grant for doing programming in order to get staff into NIIPA. Because, you know, trying to get staff and funding, she was able to get a training program together. And so I came to work for her at the gallery, and we talked about, you know, getting all the photographers together, working on, and I believe the book project came out of a conference. It came from the photographers themselves once we got them together, and putting this large exhibition together, working with Tim, working with Rick Hill, bringing everybody telling their own story, us telling our own story, going off and looking at funding, reaching out to different companies like Kodak. We were able to reach out to Kodak. We were able to reach out to Lopro to put all this work together. Because a lot of our photographers, you know, trying to find the money and the dollars in order to work on this so that everybody could tell their own story, so that we were telling our story instead of non-Indigenous people telling our story all the time. So we arranged, got the funding for it, arranged the photographers to come together. Everybody was so excited to take a look at their area, to share, to tell their story, where we were able to pull together, I think it was like 10,000 images that we were able to pull together. And we ended up working with, again, Tim and Rick and Yvonne. We went down to the Smithsonian once, the Institute of American Indian Art, once everything was submitted. We went through the exhibition, all the images that had been submitted, and were able to put the images that we have today. But just seeing, you know, everybody's story, everybody, you know, sharing from all over Turtle Island was just one of the greatest achievements to see that kind of work put together, you know. So then we were able to look at funding for cataloging. But yeah, it was so amazing, and having, you know, bringing the photographers together to discuss the project, and the energy that was in that room, and everybody wanting to share and get involved, you know, and it it was just so amazing, as you see today.
I just want to add a note in there. I'm sorry to put in, but I'm looking at also with 1992, that was a big motivator, okay? Because that was like 500 years discovery of the Americas, remember? So 92, with that coming in, Carol's always great with, you know, anniversaries and we should be doing this, we should be doing that. So when 92 was like coming down the pipe, it was like, we need to react to this. We need to do something in response to this. And the original idea and focus actually was to create a coffee table book, like a day in the life of. That was really what that was about. But again, we worked on it with working with the other photographers and that, but that's kind of where that little idea started to come. We want to react to the 1992, the discovery of the Americas. So just have to plug that in. Sorry.
Right.
Tim, I don't know if you want to jump in here. It's my understanding from the archives that the seed for this idea, which then became See Through Our Eyes, was planted by Rick and then developed by Tim, and I think Larry Mcneil was involved, and Dorothy Chocolate was involved, and then obviously NIIPA staff, Yvonne and Carol, and many others as it unfolded. But yes, Yvonne, you're very right. 1992 kind of became a motivating factor to keep pushing this idea forward. And I know that in the end, the book wasn't published because, let me say, books are very expensive to produce. But you did achieve the exhibition. And I think that that's a huge feat. And that was in 1996 at the Art Gallery of Hamilton. You presented See Through Our Eyes.
We did. We did present it then, but also to let you know, we did have influence on another book that was produced. Unfortunately, was on stateside, and they utilized many of our photographers in order to do that. I can't remember what the name of the book specifically is right now. So we still, in a way, got a publication. It just wasn't our publication, but we did.
Is that Circle
really
of
have.
Nations?
What was it?
Circle of Nations?
That's it. That's it. Yes,
Tim?
because I got mine and I got a lot of the guys, everybody to sign it. So I got like a photo autograph copy of that particular book. I love that book, right? But again, we did not have the resources to be able to produce it. But through our influence, another organization contacted us, utilized many of our photographers, and they produced this beautiful coffee table book. So a book did get published, just not ours.
Yeah. And there were other, back in, Tim, I know I need to give you a moment to speak, but the conference that you folks attended, Yvonne and Brenda and Martin Loft in 85. Yeah, it was end of 85, September 85, the photograph from the American Indian conference at Princeton. There was a publication produced out of that conference, and there were a number of NIIPA affiliated photographers that ended up in that book too. So right from the very beginning, NIIPA was helping to shape dialogue around Indigenous image making and helping create opportunities for Indigenous photographers. So Tim, I just want to give you, because you're part of the selection committee, the organizing committee for the publication and then for the show, along with Carol. So I just want maybe your perspective on the process.
Well, I really appreciate Yvonne bringing these memories back. I had, but as she plants those, in place, it starts to come back. That was an important motivating factor. The 1992 year, and the notion that Indigenous photographers are going to make a statement, and we're going to tell our own stories at that time, and so. That was sort of a really inspiring moment, and it energized people to produce more work and bring it forward. The other thing from a curatorial standpoint that I've always found really, really compelling about NIIPA and the photographers that were members of NIIPA is that when you look at the images that NIIPA photographers produced, aesthetically, emotionally, in terms of the content, it's different, right? It's different from the established photography that had existed for quite some time, since the mid 1800s, of images that were taken of Indigenous peoples. You felt more intimacy through those images. You felt humanity embedded within those images. You understood the relations between peoples more effectively. And it, the aesthetic was just really, really different. And it really speaks to me in a way that says, yeah, these were different. These photographs were different because they were Indigenous peoples documenting their own lives, or creating expressions that were important to them. And that's one of the things that really has lingered with me in terms of the impacts that NIIPA has had. It really helped the Indigenous world sort of turn a corner toward that area, or toward that idea, even though there were photographers like Horus Pulau and others who had been taking photographs, say, from the mid 1920s, things like that. Nevertheless, still, by the time we hit 1980s and 1990s, there was a great need for Indigenous peoples to document their own lives and make their own expressions through photography. And so I thought, I've always felt that NIIPA really got that, really delivered on that particular part of it.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And you're right. I think one thing that has become clear to me through my research on NIIPA is it wasn't like there weren't Indigenous photographers before the 1980s. There was, as you mentioned, Horus Pulau, Lee Marmon, we think back to Peter Pitsiolak, we think back to Jenny Ross Cobb. I mean, there are Indigenous folks producing photography from the very advent of photography. But to Yvonne's point, these folks are all disconnected. And it wasn't really until, the late 70s that folks, I think, started becoming aware of one another. And then in the 80s, you had this kind of coalescence here in Hamilton through the hard work of Yvonne and Brenda to make this happen, and to actually like, hey, folks, we're not alone. And I think you're right, Tim, that kind of birthed this movement in some sense that I see has carried forward since that time. And NIIPA, as you rightly point out, influenced so many other organizations and so many other things that came after, and that's not actually recognized. And so that's a big part of my work, is to be like, NIIPA was there, very evident.
And I've got a bit of a presentation here. I think that's a good segue into this presentation that we have.
Yes.
I wonder if Amanda can call that up about the impacts that NIIPA has had. And Rick Hill, he's a force of nature, and he's parted many seas and many waters throughout his lifetime, I must say. And one of the areas where he did this was at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. And Rick, in the mid 1980s, asked me to look through the photographic collections of the National Museum of the American Indian. I spent 4 months in New York City going through the collection. And this was to identify some photographs that were going to be used in one of the early exhibition books there, when the museum was only open in New York City at the time, or was going to be open. So anyways, the work that I had done researching those photographs ended up in the development and conceptual development of a book called Spirit Capture. We can go to that next slide, Amanda. And this goes back to what Amanda was saying about going against the grain of this notion, the prohibition that and a lot of this was sort of like just concern of historically that you had of photography somehow capturing somebody's spirit. But really, we came out with this book, Spirit Capture, that really wasn't about that, but it was really about capturing the essence who Indigenous people were in reality. So not about capturing some kind of, spirit type of thing, but really the other part of that definition, the spirit of the people. And so out of the work I'd done researching the collection, we produced this book, Photographs from the National Museum of the American Indian. And, obviously we're educating the public about what the collections held, but at the same time, and here's where the NIIPA influence comes in, is that we didn't want to just put in photographs that, were very old and taken by non-native photographers. So we interspersed within the book sections of photography that was taken by Indigenous photographers, most of whom I think were all associated with NIIPA in some way. So we can just move forward, Amanda, fairly efficiently here. I don't want to spend too much time on this. There's the book. Keep going forward. Table of contents. Myself and Rick and others wrote pieces here for the book. Natasha Benio Martinez, who was one of the curators of the photographic collection in New York City, was really important to this work, and then and others as well that I brought into the process. So let's go forward. I want to get to the photographers here. Yeah, keep going. Janine Sarna Jones. I don't know if folks remember Janine. She had some engagement doing some work with NIIPA, but she also was working at the National Museum of the American Indian in their photographic section. And so she did this really cool project where she looked and found historical images in the museum's collection from the past, and then found a descendant living during that time period, and then took photographs of the descendants and then showed those side by side. And this really goes to the point that I was making earlier about the difference in the aesthetic and the impression that these images created for people. The historic images, often with longer exposure times, often were still and frozen. But then you look at the image that Janine took, and it's lively and bright, and it's a completely different connection that's made to the people that are in that image. So go through a couple more of hers that way. Amanda, here again, you can see kind of like ancestors and then present day folks. Here's another one. Okay. Larry Mcneil. I'm sure Yvonne and others will remember Larry Mcneil, who was just really a super cool guy. I always thought Larry
I always thought so.
he was just like, he was like just one of these folks that just they're cool, they don't, it's almost effortless, and maybe that's the secret. But Larry, who was a Tlingit Niska, really had quite an impact on NIIPA, and rose to great heights himself as a. Let's move forward on Larry here. Fairly efficient.
I'll just add, Larry, like Tim, served on NIIPA's board, so wasn't just actually was board president for a number of years. So wasn't just a member, but also involved in making sure NIIPA existed. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll just move through some of these, Amanda, if we could. Some of the great shots. And I still remember these because that was such a fresh and vibrant time in our lives.
I remember that one.
Yeah, this is a gorgeous piece.
I remember that one.
I think you have the black and white of that somewhere. Here. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Something like that.
And then so Larry was documenting his life in Alaska and people there. Again, you get a closer understanding of who Indigenous peoples are today. There was an image, I think we're missing it, Amanda, but Larry actually ended up his work appearing in American embassies. He was kind of honored at an event in Washington, D.C., and one at which I was at. It was when George W. Bush was president. And there's a photograph of Larry with First Lady Laura Bush. So from Alaska to NIIPA to Washington, D.C., with the First Lady of the President of the United States. So when we talk about planting seeds and understanding where NIIPA went, Larry's a really amazing example of that. And, you know, he obviously founded upon his own tremendous talent. Dorothy Grandboy, Chippewa. Move through these, Amanda. She did this documentation of a high school that was in California that had long historically been a boarding school, like Canada's residential schools. And what I found really compelling about the images that we included in the book, and one of the reasons we did this, is it's quite a contrast to what we understand as what, you know, the experiences that Indigenous youth had at both residential schools and boarding schools in North America. And again, you get a sense of the humanity, the relationships, you know, all of this we thought was a nice refutation of some of that history, right? That times move forward and times change. And so this work was really, really interesting to put in the book.
Oh,
Larry
Larry.
Gus. You remember Larry?
Remember Larry?
Yeah.
In Navajo. So we included Larry. A few pictures here. You know, these are kind of interesting pictures. Larry did a lot of work in a lot of different areas, but the ones in the book that we included, you can move forward on this, Amanda, is books of casinos and things like that that were emerging in, you know, in the United States, in the Southwest. So Indigenous people documenting their own economic advancement and development in the communities. And casinos were such a huge turning point in terms of resourcing, providing resources for Indigenous peoples. And Catherine Fogden also worked at the National Museum of the American Indians in Mohawk. And we included a section in the Spirit Capture book of her work, all about family life, you know, families. This is Jake Swamp and his family at Akwesasne, I believe. And we just moved through these. But again, you can see the different feelings. There's laughter, there's smiles, the whole impression that you get from the photography from these Native photographers really belies what we've understood in the stereotype of who Indigenous peoples are and have been. And so that's one of the reasons I really you know, like what NIIPA's done and how it helped us advance this sort of understanding in this work. And then Horus Pulau, we included in the end of the Spirit Capture book a section on a Kiowa photographer, Horus Pulau, who was really fascinating because his work really documented that period and era of transition. You know, the so-called Indian Wars ended in the 1890s, and so when you're turning the corner in the early 20th century through 1920s and so forth, and forward from there, Horus Pulau really did a wonderful job documenting Indigenous life among his community and communities in the area. So if we can just keep flicking through some of his, and you know, you get a sense of the automobile arrives, you know, and all of these changes are happening. People are, you know, creating homesteads, Indigenous peoples in cars, you know, in parades and things of this nature. And, you know, the fashions, the fashion trends that were happening there. His work was really, really important. And what I wanted to mention here with respect to this, and I give credit to NIIPA on this, is that the New York Times art critic Colin Cotter really praised the exhibition that Rick and Natasha Bonilla Martinez produced that grew out of the book that I edited. So the Spirit Capture book became an exhibition, and Colin Cotter said it was one of the best he's ever seen. And, you know, we ended up, as a result of the work and the success of that book and exhibition, years later, in 2014, we did a second photographic exhibition at the National Museum of the American Indian on the work of Horus Pulau. The book was called For a Love of His People, the Photography of Horus Pulau. And here again, Holland Cotter was around and came back to praise that book as well. And so you know, again, I think it's important to understand from that moment when NIIPA started convening Indigenous photographers to the point where we apply the work and our understandings of what came out of that process, applied them to a major internationally renowned institution, and then one of the premier art critics in New York is praising that work. And so I think that's really important. So here's a quote I want to read from Holland Cotter. He says, "It's been said that America itself will never be at rest socially or spiritually until it has fully acknowledged and begun to repair the damage done to its first people, including damage inflicted through image making." So he was alluding to the harmful stereotypes engendered by Hollywood movies and the photographs of Edward S. Curtis and others. And Cotter really saw Pulau's pictures as an antidote to stereotyping and a harbinger of the exploration of contemporary American Indian art. And he said, Mr. Pulau's work and the work of the artists who have succeeded him clearly show that Native Americans are not waiting around. They're shaping their own restorative images of both Native and American, doing for America what America cannot or will not do for itself. And I think when you look at the mission and the work that NIIPA accomplished, that is so much in line with the discussions and conversations we had when the organization was forming, when we were having all of those meetings and conferences. You know, we were conscious about what we were doing, right? And then to see it manifest like this really is a tribute to the work that NIIPA started.
Thank you so much, Rick. Or Rick, Tim. You're both so influential. I think, you know, this is such a great segue into kind of talking about a bigger situation with NIIPA. In my own research, you're absolutely right. You know, NIIPA was the founding of NIIPA and the time that it existed was at this really critical moment, and the organizations that followed it. You know, this is the early 90s. Is a thing that we aren't going to get a chance to touch on in this panel talk. Is NIIPA's video department, which Carol knows quite a bit about, but NIIPA was also involved in early video art and supporting Indigenous documentarians working in documentary film. And, you know, we can look at the Aboriginal Media and Visual Arts Alliance that was founded by Marjorie Bokaj and company, and that, along with NIIPA, providing this foundation for what then became Imaginative, you know, and these other events that supported photography, new media, and film, and NIIPA playing a role in creating this foundation for that type of work. And so to see that it also influenced institutional practice and publication is also really incredible. I think I want to just draw some attention, so I'm going to turn to Carol here as a final question. You know, NIIPA also struggled. So NIIPA, and Yvonne can speak to this too, you know, this organization was accomplishing so much, particularly in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and yet struggled to support itself because of funding issues. And this is a problem not uncommon to a lot of Indigenous organizations. So a lot of credit goes out to the folks on the staff side for like keeping things running when money was really tight. And so I just want to provide a bit of space to talk about some of the challenges you encountered, keeping the doors open and making things happen, because that is a part of the story too.
Right. I guess one of the biggest things, that Yvonne and I, really worked well as a team. I would be looking at the checkbooks and I would say to Yvonne, we need money. We need money. So she would say, what's going on? And I would explain where we were, and we would reach out. She would write grants. We would reach out to different community organizations, writing grants and applying for different things. Whether it was staffing, whether it was project money, just that whole, we were in survival mode towards the last year, constantly in survival mode, laying ourselves off, so that we could keep the staff there and keep things running. I think, bringing our families in so that we could, helping us with the mail out, helping, whatever way we could in order to keep things moving and keep the exhibitions on the wall. It was challenging, but yet it was so fulfilling because it was such an opportunity, to share. Where else can you actually, work and be, and sharing all this culture and sharing all this art, hearing the stories, as the artists are coming in, as the exhibitions are going up, what is happening within their country, as challenging as it was so rewarding, but yeah, we had a lot of struggles, in the end, as the government changed, trying to get money for the arts, but we were very creative. Right, Yvonne? Her mic is off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I just comment on that? I do have, the storm is getting a lot worse. That's why you can't see me, and I'm not going to be on this, and I may be leaving very shortly. But that was one of the biggest struggles in keeping that organization alive. In fact, that was the main struggle that I worked with. That was my, like Carol said, she'd be like, we're really bad, we need this amount of money. And that's what I would do. I'd go out and I'd come back, it's okay, I got this amount of money. And she'd be like, how do you do that? But really, that was my role within NIIPA, and that's how I seen myself. I may not have been a mover and a shaker when it came to the images and stuff like that, but my main role, and when I think back on it, was to keep NIIPA alive. Again, like I said, I looked at it, we were the venue in which for the photographers to do the work. So in that sense, it was all about making sure we had, like I look at, like she said, we both raised our daughters almost underneath our desk. Okay, both her daughter and my daughter, we used to joke they'd be running the place in 20, 30 years, right? My husband, Curtis Ballone, he built me a dark room in every location we had. Even the beautiful one we had on James Street, like that whole facility, my husband built it for me. So for the love of me, this man did these things, right? And which enabled us to do others. But so much grew out of NIIPA, not like locally and nationally and provincially. Locally, we're also responsible for the national, wrong places, guys. The festival, Soaring Spirit Festival, which I'm going to be working in next week. That came out of NIIPA. Oh, the rain's hitting. It's really coming down now. So I'm going to probably be losing you guys. But anyway, the struggle was real. And unfortunately, OAC and Canada Council were not our best supporters. I had to go to Employment and Immigration to find funding for training programs. I became a whiz at turning these employment programs into 3-year programs, right? I managed to convince them that it takes 3 years to really train someone that they know what they're doing. And again, like Carol mentioned, the changes of government is what ruined us in the sense.
Losing her. Oh, dang. Yeah. We'll give her a minute to come back, and then we might have to just wrap up.
it's an interesting
Yeah.
reflection on how even arts agencies and funders are not necessarily aligned with some of the innovative stuff that's happening, right? I mean, there's a lot of organizations, foundations that support the arts that really should have been supporting NIIPA.
Yeah.
I don't know that I could say it's ahead of its time, but it, you know, because it was within its time, was
Mhm.
doing remarkable work. But it may be that other organizations and agencies were out of step, you know, with their understanding of the innovations that were taking place because of NIIPA.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, in my assessment and the research I've done, you know, NIIPA, oh, I think Carol's talking. Oh,
See on,
maybe she's on a separate call. Yeah, just in terms of the research that I've done, you know, NIIPA was filling a gap that needed to be filled. And at that time, there wasn't a great support for Indigenous image making, much less for photography in general. A lot of institutions weren't collecting photography till the late 80s and early 90s, much less by Native photographers. So it was, as I say, a launch pad, a network, a relationship, a community. It was all of these things in one. It was a way to build skills, to make friends, to go places. And I think that that's what's so unique about the story of NIIPA is that, as I said at the start, you know, it wasn't just emerging photographers, it was professional photographers, it was photographers doing art photography, it was photographers doing photojournalism. And I think that that's the beauty of it, that even within the scope of the work in this show, you see that diversity. And I guess as a final point, before I ask my last question to you and Carol, Yvonne saved 360 photographs all these years, which is pretty incredible. So, and of that 360, those 360 works, 125 of them made it into this exhibition. So some of the ones behind me are out of the stuff that Yvonne saved. And so being able to work with this archival material, these photographs that no one's seen since the 90s and maybe 2000s, maybe even older, some since the 80s, and being able to show them for the first time in a very long time, and to actually get to meet, you know, over email, but soon through the reunion, you know, folks that were involved is really truly an honor, and it's super exciting. And again, to your point at the top of the conversation, to convene, to actually come together again and to celebrate this moment. And that's what I'm so excited about. Is I think some of you folks haven't seen each other face to face in maybe 15, 20, 30 years. So it's going to be really, I think, a really special time. But I guess my last question, and then we'll turn it over to our guests, is what do you think kind of overall? We've talked about lots of ways NIIPA's left a legacy, but what do you think is part or the legacy of NIIPA? Maybe.
Carol?
I
You here?
guess the legacy is the opportunity that NIIPA gave so many photographers, so many staff members to show who we are and to share who we are, just getting our message out there. You know, just sharing. We certainly came together as people, as artists, sharing who we were, even though, you know, we're all different, but yet we're all the same. And just NIIPA was the opportunity. Tim?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing that resonates for me is agency, that Indigenous peoples that took hold of this medium and applied their own agency to it, saying, we're gonna document our own people and provide our own expressions through the art of photography and the communication aspects of photography. And again, when I go back to thinking about all of the images by the photographers, particularly since in those early days, you know, I was struck by the authenticity I felt from those images, the sincerity and the earnestness that to me are embedded in those works. And you know, to me, there's a distinction there, and it was very important that Indigenous peoples take their own photographs. And so for me, it's that application of the agency, taking possession of an authority over this you know, this process, this photographic process, and then putting it to work for the benefit of our people. And so that's really what stays with me. I still cherish looking at these images that my colleagues and friends took, and I just marvel at some of what I see within those images, because I find them moving, I find them evocative, I find them powerful, but most of all, I find them to be sincere, and that's I think a wonderful legacy from my perspective.
Merci beaucoup, Tim and Carol. We lost Yvonne, but thanks to her too. So I guess, yeah. So I guess we'll turn it over to our guests to the panel talk and see if anyone has any questions. Teresa, if you don't mind helping field questions, if there are any. Tim and Carol and I are happy to answer away.
Absolutely. So you'll hear me and see me pop in every once in a while. We do have some questions filtering in. We did get one early on from Cheryl York, more of a sending us a sentiment. She says, Yvonne, be safe today. I want to thank you for your work with NIIPA. What a wonderful organization it was. Best wishes with gratitude. I'll have to send that to her since she's not here at the moment. But we did get another question from the audience. From David, asks, were you aware at the time of NIIPA changing the audiences for Indigenous photography? And how did that, oops, sorry, it popped away from me. How did that impact change, if at all, the work being produced by the artists? I can reread that if you need.
No, that's good. I mean, I do think that we were conscious of what we were doing. Because we had these conversations and discussions, again, going back to Yvonne bringing up the motivation that we all had to do something to respond to the 500th anniversary of the so-called discovery of the Western Hemisphere. Mm-hmm. So I think I think we continued to work in a conscious effort to make the change and be part of a movement, if you will. I don't know that we ever thought of it as a movement, but part of this process of actually putting Indigenous photography out there for people to understand the distinctions between the impressions that others carried of us and the impressions that we held of ourselves and our peoples. So
I would say it was a movement because your first organizational objective was, and I quote, to promote a positive, realistic, and contemporary image of Native people. That was the first organizational objective. And I think truly, in my biased opinion, achieved that. Yeah, because when you see the work for itself, there's such a variety of experiences and expressions. And as I say, you have art photography right next to social documentary work, and it shows you what people were interested in. And even in the span of someone like Larry Mcneil's career, it went from photojournalism to art photography. And we see that change his practice. Right. And you see that in the work that he presented at NIIPA. So in the course of 20 years, you could see the evolution. I hate that word, but maybe the change of interest, let's say, in an artist's motivations or what they want to talk about in their work. And I think that that's what's super special. And I think that with that changed the public's perception of what was Indigenous photography and who were Indigenous peoples. I mean, this portrait behind me, This one should be familiar to Carol because this was, I think, one of the promo shots that was chosen for the book project. Yeah, there it is. By Nancy Ackerman, and it's one of my favorites in the show, which is why it's in the center of the grid. It's also one of the largest works in the show, and it's so cheeky, and it's such a great moment where the subject is letting their guard down and just letting the photographer in, and that moment you can't recreate ever again. So I think that that's the nice thing about some of these images is just that intimacy that you were talking about, Tim, that it really does come through. And you can't get that from a non-Indigenous perspective.
Yeah, the other part of it was the networking that took place, right? Because we were all much younger back then. But what happens inevitably is you move along in your career, and you end up managing and leading institutions and organizations. And so I know certainly Rick and myself, we hired a lot of NIIPA photographers over the years. Commissioned them to do works, gave them assignments and things of this nature. So again, the convening allowed for that, those associations to take place, and then growing from that created more opportunity as time moved along for Native photography to have its place in the world. And so I think that was a really important aspect of it as well.
I guess I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that some folks who were photographers went on to do, or staff folks went on to do other things after their time with NIIPA. So Joel Johnson, an early member, is now, I think, still a band council member for Walpole Island First Nation. Monty Rosel is the chair of Dina College. Like, people, these are influential, important people who have helped build their community. So they're not just only working in photography, they've served in other ways. And I think it might, even though it doesn't relate to photography specifically, I think it's still an important part of the story that NIIPA, as you say, Tim, helped to create this network. And I think some folks made their friendships, create, artistic friendships out of their time with NIIPA. And we can see that with some work of some of the members, and they continue to collaborate and hang out and be friends. And so I think that's really, really special too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you say, people change and advance in their careers, and Rick and myself become administrators at the Smithsonian and other institutions now, and we then are in a position to provide opportunities. So we don't pick up the camera like we used to anymore, but we're always cognizant of trying to provide opportunities to Native photographers.
I love that. And I think there's a comment in the chat, it's from actually my former mentee, Erin, who some of you folks might know. Erin was helping me out in the first part of this second half of this big research project. So Erin Sikora, just wanted to acknowledge her comment and the fact that I share her sentiment. I think one of the thing that has motivated me so much with this project is being a younger scholar, curator, Métis woman, and being like, why the heck didn't I know about NIIPA? Like, why did I just stumble across it while working on a project? And so for the last 5 years, it's kind of been, this is a 20-year history that needs to be talked about, because it's so important to contemporary photographic practice. And I think for myself, as somebody who studies photography, Indigenous photography specifically, there's a precedent to contemporary work, and it's found in the work that NIIPA members produce. And so younger scholars like myself and Erin really want to talk about that and be like, hey, this is a really important moment and important work and important people. And because it's our art history, and if we don't talk about it, who will? So
but and I think I can probably speak for most of us in NIIPA that we really appreciate what you all have done in terms of this sort of curatorial discovery. I don't know what you would call it, but you're coming across it. And, you know, we all are doing the work, you move on with your life, right? But for a curator such as yourself to come along with this new curiosity and putting the lens to what it is that was achieved by this organization, I think it's really useful. It's helpful. It's a wonderful thing to do, and it helps us also have a better understanding of our own lives. You know, because when you're in the midst of doing it, you're just doing it, but you are doing it with purpose, right? And so it's great for the curatorial perspective to come in and say, okay, let's do a reexamination of this work and this organization, and try to come to a more comprehensive understanding of what took place and how it happened and all of that. And so I'm very appreciative of all that you've done in this area, and it's, you know, certainly brought back a lot of memories that are actually very fond, good memories when you know, we were young and assembling in Hamilton, and it was really exciting. I you know, when I think back on it, it was like, wow, this is really cool. You know, it's really cool that this is happening. And so, again, that's where I come back to thanking Yvonne, and certainly during the concentrated time I was there with Brenda, for the leadership that they provided, you know, and then Carol as well, for the leadership that they provided, you know. So that the power of the convening had a profound impact, actually. And, I'm glad that you're acknowledging it and bringing it to the public's attention. It's a wonderful work that you're doing.
And it's perfect timing because COVID has prevented us from being able to gather. And, you know, at long last, we're going to be able to do that this summer. And I'm really excited about that. And I think, you know, I guess it's a final point on my part, and then I'll open it up to the two of you. I owe a huge debt to Carol and to Yvonne for giving me their personal archives to work with, because the fact of the matter is there is nothing published on NIIPA other than what myself and Aaron have written.
Yeah.
And so there's no comprehensive history on NIIPA. And so I had to really turn to places like Sarna or Toronto Reference Library, or which were really the two major public sources of information on NIIPA. And then everything else came directly from Carol dumping files in my hand and Yvonne dumping files in my hand and saying, here you go, do something with it. And I think this is one of those situations where with the first iteration of the project, #NoFilterNeeded, I thought, okay, cute little show about NIIPA and how it was founded. And then Yvonne comes along and she's like, here you go, you're not done yet, you got more to do. And that's just kind of how it all happened, was like, the work's not done. So here we are 5 years later, trying to kind of bring it all together.
And it's the thing about history, right? How did things get to be the way they are? You know, and so that our realities today are founded upon the antecedents of the past, right? And so NIIPA is a platform, you know, had been a platform. And so when we look at these books at the Smithsonian, and we look at these other successes that the individual photographers have had, you know, much of that is influenced by, you know, has been motivated by their or our connection to this organization, right? But you wouldn't know that, and you wouldn't see it and understand it necessarily. How does the Smithsonian end up doing an exhibition on Horus Pulau, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just, okay, you go to the exhibition and there it is. But the reality is it really had this pathway, right? We started with the Spirit Capture book, then the Spirit Capture exhibition, mentioned Horus Pulau. Years later, we came back around when I was overseeing and chairing the exhibit assessment group at the NMAI. And we said, we need to get back to doing a photography exhibit. And so Horus Pulau became the person we wanted to focus on. And so that then activated the whole process there. But we, you know, we live in the here and now, and we don't often pay attention to how things got to be the way they are. And so that's why it's, again, it's very important that you're reminding us all of how much of this happened.
I mean, it makes me excited. I'm just a curious person and I like to know how we got to where we are. So I guess that's how it all ended up continuing on in this way. And I just owe a huge debt of gratitude to the three of you, you, Yvonne and Carol, and the rest of the members. I mean, the show that we have up right now, it features work, NIIPA 2020. It's kind of a play on words. Yvonne inspired the title, Hindsight 2020.
Nice.
It was originally supposed to happen in 2020, but pandemic. And NIIPA existed for 20 years. So it was kind of had this number had some meaning, and we kind of ran with that. But the show has over 150 works. 50 photographers are represented. They're not all of the member photographers that were part of NIIPA through the years, but this is the photographers that we could represent with work out of what Yvonne saved and what's publicly accessible. And so it's a good chunk of the folks that were involved. Tim, you're a part of the show. So it's just really exciting to be sharing this work with the public after so long, and eventually this history, because we're working on the comprehensive publication. So I don't know if Trace, if there's more questions in the chat. If there is, we can take them.
We do indeed. We have a couple of comments and a question. So one of the comments from Sheila, they had put a link to the Building Cultural Legacies essay that you wrote, Rayanne, a few years ago. I just want to let everybody know wonderful information about NIIPA. We will include that in the video description of this video when it gets posted on YouTube. We also have a comment from Abdar saying, thank you, Rayanne, and the wonderful panelists for bringing this important history to light once again. NIIPA's incredible work deserves to be more widely seen and celebrated. Thank you so much for that comment. And our question, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
And our question is from Tom, asks, how do you feel about the current work of Native photographers? Is it hitting the mark?
All right, this is Tom Fields, by the way, folks. So that name should ring a bell. Mr. Tom Fields in the chat. He was a NIIPA photographer as well. So I actually should say, Tom, you answered that question. I mean, I think there's some incredible photography that's coming out right now, but I think the thing I see as a younger scholar who looks at Indigenous photography is that there's a precedent for the aesthetics. And I think sometimes maybe some of these contemporary Indigenous photographers think they're working in isolation, or that these are original ideas. And, on some level they are, but there are people who were doing those sorts of things 15, 20, 30 years ago. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that through line. So for me, a lot of the work that I really gravitate towards is portraiture. But I do love art photography as well. So I'm not going to name drop any photographers, but I do love what is being produced now. So I'm not going to dig myself a hole, but I'll let Tim and Carol talk.
Well, I would just say that, one of the things that's happened over the last, 20, 30 years is technology. And so Indigenous photographers today have access to all kinds of programs and creative platforms to extend the range of their creative expression and so forth. And so from what I'm seeing in Indigenous publications, books, magazines, online media, that it's extraordinary. When I think, looking back to the mid 80s and through the 90s and now where we're at today, the level of creativity is just it's really incredible to me. Now I'm not moved into more administrative and management work, so I haven't kept current with all of that, but I do marvel at what I see being produced today. So I think I think Native photographers today are doing a great job. Carol?
I too am in administrative work right now. But I think anytime that we can get our message and we can share, you know, who we are, it is great, you know, as long as we're, you know, showing who we are, and we're putting things out there. I mean, we're telling our stories. I mean, that's the positive, that we all need to do that.
You know, within the Canadian context too, there is actually today a great deal of news coverage of Indigenous affairs and Indigenous relations. And I can't help but think, and you know, there's been a number of historic processes that have happened as well since then. You know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and so forth, that there's a lot more attention on Indigenous peoples issues. And I think we were highlighting and documenting much of that back in the day. And so I think this is another part of the legacy that NIIPA has. And yeah, and so I think it's been pretty impressive.
Go NIIPA, go. Yvonne wants to, she had jokingly said that she'd like to see the organization revived. I'm like, find somebody else to do it. I'm joking. No,
it's kind of
NIIPA
interesting.
Chapter 2.
pardon?
NIIPA Chapter 2.
Yeah,
Yeah.
NIIPA Chapter 2. I mean, some young photographers could easily pick that up. The incorporation is still there. NIIPA did not legally disappear. So somebody, yeah, NIIPA still exists as a legal organization that's registered. So somebody could revive this. And I'm happy to support that in whatever way. I'm not a photographer, so I don't think it should be me, but I'm happy to turn over my knowledge and resources to younger photographers who would be interested in doing something like that. Absolutely.
I'd certainly second that motion. And I think today, again, because the funders back then were hard to turn over, like, what's this Indigenous photography? What, you know, what's this all about? It's such a niche idea in a way. But I would tend to think, because of all the developments that have taken place within Canada, that arts funding would be more available, and different types of funding, programmatic funding would be much more available today than it was back then. I mean, you know, Yvonne and Brendan Carroll really, as they described in today's program, really had to work really hard to scrape up the resources and to be very creative, you know, about bringing resources into the organization to keep things rolling forward. So I tend to believe that there'd be a great deal of opportunity at this time.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent point on which to draw our chat to a close. Bunch of creative natives can pick up the torch and carry it forward. I'm just super grateful for this time with the two of you. It's been a long time since we've seen each other, and I know we're going to be seeing each other more this summer. But it's just super exciting to finally be celebrating NIIPA in this way after so many years. So Marcy Miigwech for your time, and to Teresa and Elise, and to Annette and Diane for helping with today's panel talk, and Amanda as well, Tim's assistant. Thank you. So if there's no other questions, I'm just going to turn it over to Teresa to wrap us up.
Thank you so much. We have expressions of gratitude from Simon Glass saying thank you for this panel and for NIIPA, such important history. And Mariana says, thank you so much for the excellent talk and the education, Miigwech. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending today. It was an honor for me to help introduce you and close out our wonderful session together. Thank you so much to our panelists, Rayanne, and as we also said, our wonderful 2 ASL signers, and Amanda. We had a wonderful slideshow too. It was fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go.
Thank you so much for putting that together. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and I really appreciate our time together. Thank you.